Coming in at number 10, we have the Los Feliz murder house. Back in the 1950s, in a quaint town of Los Feliz, there would be something horrific that would take place on Christmas Eve. A doctor would come home to his wife and 3 children to have dinner with them. Everything seemed to be normal, but it turned out that something horrible was brewing. That night, when everyone was asleep, he grabbed a hammer, came upstairs, and ended his wife's life. He then went after his children, but they were able to get away and find protection with the neighbors before he was able to do any sort of serious damage. The police came through, and by the time they got there, they found the doctor dead next to his wife. He did an intentional overdose with sleeping pills. The neighborhood was now in terror, but the mystery still stands as to why this father of 3 would all of a sudden snap. There was evidence that the family was having some financial struggles, and the pressure of his family living in poverty might have drove the man mad. Others think that there could have been an affair or some sort of drug use that made the husband go crazy, but in the end the intention of this deranged man was taken to the grave with him. Coming in at number 9, we have Matilda Rooney explodes. The last thing you want to happen on Christmas is your wife to explode in front of you, but not everyone is so lucky. For this story we need to go back to the 1700s. Matilda and Patrick Rooney were an old couple that didn't have much to do on Christmas or many friends to share it with, so they decided to invite John Larson over to spend some time with them on this Christmas night. The 3 of them would have a wonderful dinner, and after an evening of some drinks, John found himself sleepy and decided it was time to go to bed. He woke up in the middle of the night because he could smell smoke. He just assumed that someone was burning a fire outside, and he decided that he would go back to sleep. Well, when he woke up in the morning, he would find something much more deadly than a small fire. There was a pair of burnt feet that were singed into the ground and a deep hole of ash. It looked as if an extremely intense ball of heat incinerated something on the spot. John was shocked and rushed to find Patrick, who was found dead. Apparently he died from smoke inhalation. None of this made sense because there was almost no way that someone could have lit Matilda on fire without burning down the house. It would seem that she spontaneously combusted. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Coming in at number 8, we have the cat food console. I'm sure you guys have heard of the recent debacle of people ordering PS5s and them not arriving, but instead they get a big box of cat food at their front door. If that happened to me, I think I would spontaneously combust. But as it turns out, this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. Well, kinda. This story was pulled from Reddit, and while it's not as brutal as the first 2, it's still just as scary, I think. A Reddit user talked about how on Christmas, when they were only 8 years old, they were ripping open presents under the tree. They were having a great time, and then they got to one that really changed the mood in the room. It was a box of cat food. They were shocked at first, and then they were upset, but they quickly understood that this was a joke, and then they turned to laugh with their family. But the look on their parents' face was pure horror. Apparently this box of cat food was supposed to be a laptop. They had wrapped the gift themselves. His parents were shocked and grilled the other members of the family who were there, but no one knew what was going on. In the end, they never found out what happened to the laptop. What might have happened is someone broke into the house and replaced the present with duds that had the same wrapping paper. That would suck. Coming in at number 7, we have the night before Christmas. If you're gonna put some work out there, you better slap your name on it because people will try and take credit for it if you don't. To this day, no one knows who sent the poem "'Twas a Night Before Christmas" to the Troy newspaper in 1823. The author, Clement Clark Moore, came forward to take credit for it, but there are several people who think it would have been impossible for Moore to write this piece. For one, the dude was a sourpuss who had no love in his heart. That's a real thing that people would say about him. And when rewriting the poem, he wrote the names of the 2 reindeer as Donner and Blitzen, as we all know them. But the only reason that those names are like that is because of a printing error. The original names were Dunder and Blitzen, which are Dutch for thunder and lightning. Coming in at number 6, we have Patty Vaughn. Patty Vaughn and her husband were slowly splitting up. They had already decided that they didn't want to be together anymore, but things were kind of complicated because they had 3 kids together. Tensions kept building until everything exploded on Christmas Eve. Patty Vaughn's husband, JR, found out that she was already seeing other people. Patty fled the house and took took off with her van. This was the last time that anyone heard from her. Her van was found later with blood splattered in it. An investigation was launched, but no evidence ever came back to link JR to the death of his missing wife. Eventually he moved his family out of state, and it stands as a mystery to this day. Some of the more plausible explanations for this are that JR and his family tracked down Patty, and as a group they killed and disposed of her body, but to this day nothing has been solved. Coming in at number 5 is the arson bandit. Back in the 1970s, a series of fires were lit in a small town in the southern United States. These were violent acts that seemed to be all targeted at family homes, but then again it might have just been random. 8 fires were lit for unknown reasons, and all of them were done on Christmas Eve within a 5-mile radius of each other. It would seem that none of these families had anything in common with each other, so these fires were most likely lit at random. Someone was out there and just wanted to watch the world burn. Coming in at number 4, we have the missing Sodder children. The year was 1945, and the Sodders would have something happen to them that would change their lives forever. George and Jenny Sodder were the parents of 9 children, and on Christmas Eve their house would catch fire, and they were in a panic to save their kids. They were only able to get 4 of their 9 kids out of the fire safely. The blaze burned in front of them, and the family was in terror as they couldn't find their other children. The fire eventually burned out, and after investigating the home, there were more questions to be raised. The bodies of the 5 children were nowhere to be found. Even though they were caught in a fire, there should have been some of the remains left behind, but there was nothing. This led the family to believe that they could have maybe made it out of the fire. Both the parents searched for their children until the day they died. They even put up billboards with their pictures to try and see if anyone could find them. There were suspicions that the mafia could have lit their home on fire and kidnapped their kids because George Sodder was very outspoken about how he hated Mussolini. Next on the list we have Kimberly Maria McLean. This is a wild story. Kimberly McLean was married to a very wealthy man in Texas. The two of them had a family, but he was very suspicious of her. Kimberly was a very secretive person, and she would tell her husband very little about her past. Eventually her lies started to catch up with her, and her husband wanted the truth. Kimberly kept lying. This led to her husband divorcing her, and this made Kimberly fall into a deep depression. On Christmas Eve she would walk onto her in-laws' front lawn and take her own life. This launched a massive investigation, and it turns out that Kimberly McLean had been using a fake identity this whole time. Her husband didn't even know her as Kimberly. The name he knew her as the entire time was Lori Erica Ruff, and that was the 3rd identity she had used. She had been jumping from persona to persona ever since she was 17 years old when she ran away from home. She was able to take the identity of a dead person and get a social insurance number, and then she changed her identity again when she moved to Texas. Coming in at number 2 we have Tracey Mertens. Tracey Mertens was dating Joey Cavanagh, and the two of them were raising their children together. They weren't in the best relationship, and Joey had an on-again off-again battle with drugs. This led to him constantly owing people money. They had just moved to a new town, and it was just a few days before Christmas when they were all set to settle down. Tracey went back to their old home to grab the last few things, but in that moment she was attacked. 2 men grabbed her, tied her up, and started to interrogate her to find out where her boyfriend was. They would later take her to a church and try to kill her by lighting her on fire. She would survive long enough to give her story to the police, but due to complications she would die a few days later. To this day, no one knows who might have killed Tracey Mertens. Her boyfriend Joey Cavanagh has been questioned several times about who could have committed these crimes, but he insists that he has no idea who could have done this. And coming at the number 1 spot we have the disappearance of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. This was one of the biggest missing person cases to ever hit New Zealand. This took place right after Christmas. Ben Smart and Olivia Hope were having a big night of partying. They were seen at the Furno Lodge, which was a hot spot that night. There were a ton of people celebrating. The two of them met a stranger that offered them a ride back to a yacht where the two of them could keep partying all night long. They jumped on the boat and got ferried over to this yacht. I mean, it would be hard to say no to something like that. Well, this would be the last time that anyone would see them. Their parents would report them missing, and after a thorough investigation they found that Scott Watson could be the killer. He was later convicted of killing both of them, but to this day the remains of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope have never been found. Some people believe that Scott is innocent, and he has appealed this case several times. In 2020 the case was reopened to investigation.
Starting off this countdown we have the spontaneous human combustion. Now we are starting off this countdown with a very very strange mystery. It was Christmas Eve night of 1885, and a farmhand, John Larson, was invited to spend the holidays with his employers, Patrick and Matilda Rooney. The three spent the night drinking and just having a good time. During the middle of the night, Larson woke up and had a bad coughing fit, but eventually he fell back asleep. But when he woke up the next day, he found that there had been a fire downstairs. Patrick was found dead in his room. He had suffocated from the smoke. Now this is where it gets weird. In the kitchen, there was just a huge black hole on the floor. Beside it was Matilda's foot and her ashes and some bone fragments. Somehow, a fire had started from within her own body and she burst into flames. As one article puts it, the fire seemed to have started in her body and stayed confined to her body. That is absolutely so hard to believe. But this also explains why Larson woke up in the middle of the night coughing. It was from the smoke. Luckily, he was far enough away from the fire so he did not suffocate. But for Matilda, well, let's just say that this case is truly bizarre. Coming in at number 9, we have Jane Doe. On December 18th in 1996, an unidentified woman was found dead lying on a plastic sheet in a cemetery. The woman was roughly around 60 years old and to this day has never been identified. She had passed away from asphyxiation by the bag placed over her head. Here's the weird part. Alongside her was a note that read, "Deceased by own hand. Prefer no autopsy." It was signed Jane Doe. On top of that, she left a request to be cremated and even left money to cover the cost. When she was found, there was also a little Christmas tree that was set up beside her and it was decorated. And she passed away with headphones in listening to a comedy routine. I swear, this case just keeps getting weirder and weirder. To this day, no one knows who this woman is or why she took her own life, if she even took her own life. In our 8th spot, we have the UFOs of Warminster. All throughout the 1960s to 70s, Warminster, a town in the UK, had a bunch of UFO sightings. In 1964, that's when the town was hit by a bunch of alien sonic attacks. A number of residents in the town heard these unexplainable sounds. They said it was like a strong pounding vibration. No one could see anything, but a bunch of people heard these sounds, like 30 soldiers at a base camp. But there was one lady who was affected most by it, and her name was Marjorie Bye. She was on her way to church for a Christmas service when she heard the sounds. The sounds were so strong that she became paralyzed. She was knocked to the ground and unable to move. She said she was pinned down by the invisible fingers of sound. That's a direct quote from her. Very interesting. So what was it that they all were hearing? After that incident, increased UFO sightings appeared. So could it be that this force was something out of this world? Moving on to number 7, we have the SODDER children. Of course this case had to be on the list. It's one of the most famous cases out there. Chances are you've probably heard me talk about it before. In West Virginia on December 24th, 1945, George and Jenny SODDER's home was burned down. 9 out of 10 of their children were in the home at the time of the fire. However, only 4 made it out. The other 5 seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Investigators believed that the children perished in the fire. However, none of their bones were found. Initially, the fire was said to be an electrical fire, but the family's Christmas lights stayed on throughout the fire. If it was an electrical fire, that wouldn't have happened. On top of that, someone had cut the phone lines to their house, and for some reason, their car wasn't working. Apparently, a woman claimed to have seen the 5 children watching their house burn from a passing car. Then another woman claimed she saw the children at a hotel a week after the fire. They were accompanied by 4 strangers. So it seems like the 5 kids were kidnapped and then the house set on fire was just a whole decoy. Still, their disappearance remains a mystery to this day. Moving on to number 6, we have Patty Vaughn. On December 25th, 1996, 32-year-old mother of 3 Patty Vaughn disappeared from her Texas home. Over 23 years later, her family is still determined to find out what happened to her. So apparently on Christmas Day, Patty spent the morning fighting with her estranged husband, J.R. Vaughn. When her family called her, she apparently sounded quite upset and as if she had just been crying. Her sister went over to the house for Christmas dinner, but when she arrived, JR told her that Patty wasn't feeling well and was up in her room. He then claimed that later that night they got into another fight and she drove off. The next day, Patty's van was found abandoned by the side of the road. Upon investigating, police found Patty's blood in the house and in the van. Investigators believe that Patty was killed in the house and then later placed in the van. Obviously, JR is the person of interest. That man is sketchy, but due to the lack of evidence, he was never charged or arrested. And to this day, we still don't know what happened to Patty. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with RHONDA HINSON. On the evening of December 22nd, 1981, 19-year-old RHONDA HINSON was on her way home after she had just dropped her friends off home from a work Christmas party. However, while on her way home, she was shot in the heart by a high-powered rifle. The bullet ended up traveling through the trunk, through the driver's seat, and then into her heart. Why she was murdered and by who still remains a huge mystery. Now, a couple of weeks prior, RHONDA's parents claimed that she was acting a bit different. At one point, she asked her mom if it was acceptable for her to be dating a married man. So does that have something to do with her death or what? So according to police, they believe that RHONDA may have known her killer. This case is just super weird and terrifying. And at number 4, we have Olivia Hope and Ben Smart. So it was New Year's Eve in 1997, and Olivia Hope and Ben Smart were out celebrating. When the two were done, they took a water taxi back to find some lodging for the night. However, they found that the berths were already full, so they went back on the water taxi to find another place to stay. That's when they encountered a man who offered them a place to stay on his yacht. They accepted the offer, and that was the last time the two were ever seen. Eventually, police discovered that this man was Scott Watson, but of course he denies any of the claims against him. To this day, we still don't truly know what happened to the pair. Coming in at number 3, we have Jonelle Matthews. On December 20th, 1984, Jonelle Matthews arrived home after performing at her school's holiday concert. Her family was unable to attend, so she got dropped off at home by her friend. Now, we know for sure that she did arrive home safely, since at 8:30 p.m. she answered the phone and took a message for her dad. But what happened after that remains a mystery. Her father arrived home at 9:30 and found Jonelle missing. The garage door was open and Jonelle was nowhere to be found. Later on, police found footsteps in the snow around the house that made it seem as if someone was looking in the windows. So they believe that she was kidnapped. But what's odd is that there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. Poor Jonelle, no one knows what happened to her. Moving on to number 2, we have LATRICIA White. On December 27th, 1993, LATRICIA White was found dead in her bed. She had been shot a number of times. Her boyfriend and son were nowhere to be found. 3 days later, his pickup truck was found abandoned. In it, there was his wallet, checkbook, and Christmas presents. All were covered with blood. But the blood didn't belong to LATRICIA. In fact, tests couldn't conclude who the blood belonged to. 4 months after the murder and disappearance, the son's grandfather received a call from him. All he said was, "Help me, help me." That was the last time he was ever heard from. The whereabouts of the boyfriend and son are still unknown. Either the boyfriend is behind all this, or the two were kidnapped by LATRICIA's murderer. And in our number 1 spot, we have Mike RIEMER and Diana Robertson. On December 12, 1985, Mike RIEMER, his girlfriend Diana Robertson, and their daughter Crystal all went to the woods to find a Christmas tree. What went down in the woods still remains a mystery. But next thing you know, Crystal is wandering around in a Kmart by herself. She was later picked up by her grandmother, who identified her. All she said was, "Mommy is in the trees." Months later, her mom's body was found in the forest. It was thought that Mike had killed her and then run off. But in 2011, hunters found a skull with a bullet hole in it. It was later identified as Mike's. So they don't know who killed the couple. On top of that, 4 months earlier, another couple was killed in a similar manner. So it seems to be the works of a serial killer, but they have never been caught. Alright, and starting us off at number 10, we have Grýla. This Icelandic lady as the holiday version of the witch from Hansel and Gretel, who lives in the gingerbread house and eats children.
Except her house is a cave and she's a giant and has superpowers to sniff out bad kids on the naughty list in nearby towns before kidnapping them and making them into stew. Next up on this list is number 9.
He roamed at large, hungry and evil, in the freezing Yule snow in every home. People shuddered at his name. If one heard a pitiful meow, something evil would happen soon.
Okay, so if Grýla wasn't creepy enough for you guys, so we got her cat. The Yule cat is up next.
The legend goes back and forth on this one, with some saying that the cat stalks prey who are wearing old clothes on Christmas Eve, as opposed to new clothes that the wool farmers had forced their employees into making.
So this cat was seemingly used as a scare tactic for slave labor around the holiday.
Other legends say this cat simply ate other people's food. But back in the day, when these legends were a very real part of society, that still wasn't ideal either, because, well, food wasn't as plentiful and available Yule as it is today. Next up at number 8 we have the Yule lads.
According to Icelandic legend, the Yule lads are the 13 sons of the mountain trolls, Grýla and her lazy husband.
This one is creepy in essence, but I'm getting a real 7 dwarves vibe. So the 13 Yule lads were kind of like Santa's little helpers, full of mischief and named accordingly. But here's where it goes south. Get it? South Pole, not North Pole. But anyways, back to what I'm saying, Santa, or Snow White in this case, is Grýla, and that's their mother. Many legends say that they also eat children. Others say they just wreak havoc on them in evil, mischievous ways.
Next up, number 7.
Frau Perchta. Frau Perchta, though largely unknown in the West, holds deep roots embedded in the folklore of Eastern Europe tradition. A reputation as the Witch of Christmas.
Care to flip a coin for your Christmas fates? Psh, I know I would. You got a 50-50 chance. Well, that's kind of what Eastern European kids did with this next monster. Frau Perchta, the monster we're talking about right now, or Berthcha, well, she would leave a coin in a child's shoe if they were a good kid. The flip side to this, however, is the naughty list. Well, what happens on the naughty list, you ask? Well, this is where it gets really awful. The monster is said to slice open the abdomen and take out what's there and replace it with straw and pebbles. It's called the Feast of Epiphany. More inspiration for classic Disney movies begins with this story. Frau Perchta is either presented as a beautiful young lady or a wicked old hag with a large foot. There's evidence that suggests that she is a shapeshifter. I could be her right now.
Alright, moving on, number 6, we have Santa's evil twin.
Auntie Claus, as the name would suggest, is the evil doppelganger of the ever-beloved Christmas father figure, otherwise known as Santa Claus.
He's up next on the list and he goes by the name of Pierre Foutard.
Actually goes by a couple different names as he translates into Father Whipper. Although it's kind of weird because it has nothing to do with the legend of this creepy, dark Santa.
As it goes, he was an innkeeper who murdered 3 boys, and when Saint Nicholas, aka Santa, found out, he resurrected the boys back to life and condemned old Pierre to a life of repenting his sins.
But Santa brings him out annually on St. Nicholas Day to handle the kids on the naughty list with his whip. And moving right along, number 5, speaking of switches, this next Christmas creep uses them too.
And what's more, he is said to be a pal of old Saint Nick as well.
BELSNICKEL originated in Germany but has gained popularity in North America.
This unkempt troll-looking monster visits kiddos in the weeks leading up to Christmas Day, and visits to see who is naughty and nice so he can whip them into shape, literally.
Well, you know what? This guy doesn't discriminate, and I think this year I am on the naughty list.
And at number 4, we have Krampus. Okay, so while there are some classic Christmas monsters that didn't make this list, like the Grinch, we couldn't not put Krampus on here.
But he's sliding in at number 4. If you don't know who Krampus is, I don't know where you've been living. I suggest you put it on your Christmas movie list this year. You should be watching it right after you watch our video, and watch it right after you watch Home Alone.
Krampus means claw and is one of the more famous Christmas monsters to date.
This guy is half goat and half demon, and this thing punishes the naughty kids, and he'll punish them in any tragic or horrifying way he can, including drowning them, eating them, or just sending them to hell. And I can't forget about whipping kids, because every
monster on this list just
yeah, let's just result to
oh man.
And coming in at number 3, the Tomten is a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde style like gnome that is said to possess human-like strength. He is said to kill livestock, give a hellish beating, another monster beating kids, and even kill you with his poisonous bite after driving you absolutely insane. Well, you know what? Although I just listed all those things, he's not that bad though. He will literally protect your house if he likes you, and of course, if you treat him well, he'll treat you well.
And now at number 2. Some of you may have seen the cult classic film Gremlins, which is widely regarded as a Christmas movie because the film takes place at Christmas time, when a father buys his son a pet named Mogwai, which means monster in Cantonese, from a shop in Chinatown. Pretty sure this movie is where the inspiration for the 90s toy Furby came from, because they look identical and they're both super creepy. That is, of course, unless you get them wet or feed them after midnight. Which is exactly what happened in this movie. Well, let's rewind. This film was actually based off of an old folklore, and even got more popular in World War II when the government used advertisements to warn people of malfunctions in aircrafts and blaming these creatures for causing them.
And finally, at number 1, the Grither. I feel like we should be bleeping out this guy's name because, as the legend has it, he doesn't like hearing it out loud. So why did I just say it?
Whoops! The lives on the other side of Santa's workshop in an old abandoned ship.
So his hands are as big as basketballs and his arms the length of massive snakes.
The veins are pumped with fear and anger, not blood, and he hates being cold and wet, which is exactly what you would think an abandoned Arctic ship in the North Pole would feel like.
So every time the hears its name, it grows its ears double the size, eventually growing so large that the can fly like Dumbo.
This is only a tale though, and anyone that can actually verify the has been eaten.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have the sock puppet. This one comes from Ireland, where many years ago a man owned all the land around a village and rented it out to the poor farmers there for a profit. He was very kind to his own family but brutal to the other villagers. He made a fortune from this cruelty. The villagers hatched a plan to overthrow him one day. One Christmas night he threw a lavish party for his friends while the villagers were starving in the cold. A villager arrived bearing a gift. He said it was a present for the rich man's daughter. The girl opened it to find a sock puppet that the villager had knitted. He asked for some food in return. The rich man gave him a single potato. The girl loved the sock puppet though. She named it Charlie. She took it to bed that night. When her father went to check on her, she was fast asleep. But he noticed that Charlie was still on her hand and its plastic eyes were staring right at him. The villagers were about to get their bloody revenge on the rich man thanks to a murderous sock puppet called Charlie. Moving on to number 9 now, we have Christmas tree decorations. This is a story from Scary for Kids about a girl called Juliet who was decorating a Christmas tree. Her mum was working late, and so when she finished with the tree, she sat down to watch some TV. It was then that she heard a scratching noise at the door. She looked through the peephole to see a man outside. He was a large, bearded guy in a red suit with fluffy white trim. He banged on the door loudly. Juliet asked, "Who's there?" The man said he was Santa Claus and that he wanted to come in because he was cold and tired and hungry. Juliet didn't believe him. She told him that her mother wasn't home and she wanted him to leave. His face began to go red and twist with anger. He knocked even harder and growled,
"It's Santa Claus, Juliet. Have you laid out some milk and cookies for me, Juliet? You know how much Santa loves his milk and cookies."
Honestly, it's a creepy story from start to finish, and it only gets worse for Juliet from there. All I'll say is make sure you don't read it right after you've eaten. Moving on to number 8 now, we have The Figure. This one comes from Arthur H, who shared his story on cagemom.com. He said, "My mother, to whom I was very close, passed away in 1964 when I was 17 years old. I left home that year and moved to Ontario from Nova Scotia. In 1969 I met a girl who I will call Karen, and we got married in March of 1970. In December of 1971 we were expecting our first child. We were living in a small 1.5 bedroom bungalow. There was a fireplace in the living room. My wife and I loved the fireplace and we had it lit every night. It was Christmas Eve 1971 and we had just finished putting the gifts under the tree and a nice fire gave off a beautiful glow. On the tree, one string of lights which was supposed to flash had stopped several days before. It was 5 minutes to midnight when the fireplace suddenly just about went out and a string of lights started to flash and the other lights stopped flashing. My wife and I were sitting on the floor and it had become very chilly in the room. I looked over to my lazy boy chair and a figure was sitting there. My mother with a big beautiful smile on her face. My wife, who had never met my mother, said she could see the same thing. This ghost never spoke but just kept looking at me and my wife and smiling. At 12 midnight the fire in the fireplace started up again and the lights on the tree stopped flashing and the others started flashing again. I looked over in the chair and the ghost was gone. No matter what I did to those Christmas lights, they never flashed again. Next up at number 7 now, we have The Boy Who Killed Santa Claus. This one was written by Mark Allen Gunnels. It's about a 7-year-old boy called Henry Childers. He asked his mum to stay up past 10 on Christmas Eve one year, but she warned him that if he didn't go to sleep, Santa wouldn't come that night. He had hoped that Santa would get things right this year. Last year, he asked for an Xbox, but he got a PlayStation instead. His mum told him not to worry, Santa was probably all out of Xboxes, but Henry had not forgotten. Henry had a rage inside of him. He had been plotting all year. He knew he was too little to fight Santa, but he also knew that Santa liked to have milk and cookies. He also knew that food and drink can always be poisoned. Finish the story to find out what happened to the boy who killed Santa Claus. It's a good one. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Bloody Axe. This story actually comes from an old horror comic, and the pictures you're seeing now are from just that. It's written from the perspective of an 8-year-old boy. He would lie very still under the old moth-eaten quilt his mother had made for him. He would be wide awake and listen out for sounds. On one Christmas Eve, he heard the front door closing and the clomp, clomp, clomp of his father's mud-caked boots, and then there was the sound of dripping on the stairs. Drip, drip, drip. Then his father would pass by his doorway and the light would cast his shadow on the bedroom wall and the shadow of the bloody axe he always carried in his hands. At breakfast the next morning, he slowly asked his mother where his father had been last night. She looked at him with sad eyes but never said a word. By the end of this story though, we learn that there is a connection with the rumours of the nearby axe murderer and his father's return every night. Let's just say it doesn't have a pretty ending. Moving on to number 5 now, we have The Carol Singers. This is a story based on The Vanishing House by Bernard Capes. The storyteller said that when they were a boy, their grandfather and father were alcoholics who never worked. They could play instruments though. On one Christmas Eve, they took him Christmas caroling with them, door to door. It was a dark night, snow was falling and the wind cut through them like a knife. They came to a big mansion decorated with Christmas lights. The grandfather knocked on the front door and they began to play some old Christmas carols. When the door finally swung open, in the dim light they could see a young woman stood holding a tray of glasses in her hands. She picked up a glass and handed it to the grandfather, who excitedly took it. The boy looked up to a window above and saw a hideous face peering out of the shadows. He looked back at the woman in the doorway and her face had twisted hideously too. They would live to regret the day they ever came to that mansion and the grandfather taking that glass. Alright everyone, moving on to number 4 now, we have The Clown Puppet. There was once 3 sisters aged 15, 12 and 7. They told their parents what they wanted for their Christmas gift of choice. The oldest asked for a laptop, the middle for an iPad and the youngest for a small doll. On Christmas Day, the oldest and middle daughters got what they asked for. They were over the moon. The youngest daughter didn't receive a doll though. Instead, she got a clown puppet. She thought it was cute and so she kept it. 2 days later, the youngest daughter disappeared. The next Christmas, the oldest daughter asked for an iPad and the middle child asked for a clown puppet. Sure enough, 2 days later, she disappeared. The next Christmas, the last remaining daughter asked for a clown puppet in memory of her sisters. She disappeared as well. The heartbroken parents never recovered. They eventually became so poor they had to sell everything for money. One day they went into the attic to look for items to sell. That's when they saw, in the darkness at the very back, the clown puppet was sitting on a throne made from lollipop sticks. Arranged all around it were the severed heads and limbs of the 3 missing girls. Next up at number 3 now, we have The Greether. He told them the story of the grifter, the most awful thing in the world. He lives in a cave at the North Pole. The coldest, wettest place on earth is where the grifter makes his home. He sleeps in the wreck of a ship. He doesn't mind the cold and he doesn't mind the wet, but the thing he hates most of all is to hear someone say his name. He has very good ears and they get bigger every time his name is spoken anywhere on earth. Sometimes his ears get so big he can use them to fly. At this point, Steffa said she didn't like the story. It was scaring her. It's too late now, the mother said. We've already mentioned his name. The grifter is probably on his way to our house this very minute. Those words will come to haunt them before this story ends. Moving on to number 2 now, guys, we have BELSNICKEL. If you're watching this from a Germanic speaking country, you may be familiar already with this story. In that part of the world, the BELSNICKEL is a fur-clad Christmas gift bringer. He has a long tongue and is typically very ragged and disheveled. His clothes are dirty and ripped, and he's known for beating misbehaved children with a stick. He's a mythical creature that serves as an almost anti-Santa-like creature. If it's Santa's job to deliver joy and presents, it's the BELSNICKEL's job to make sure they deserve it. And finally, number 1 now, we have purple fingernails. This one comes from the Scary for Kids website, and I'll read it exactly as I found it. There was once a little girl who had a large collection of dolls. One Christmas, she saw a doll in the window of a department store that she absolutely had to have. It had long, flowing blonde hair and a lovely blue dress. But the thing that impressed her the most about the doll was that it had lovely, bold, purple fingernails. When Christmas morning came, she was delighted to find the doll with the purple fingernails lying under the Christmas tree. She played with it all day, and when she went to sleep, she put it on the table at her bedside. That night, the little girl was awakened by strange noises. It was still dark outside. She looked over for her doll, but it was nowhere to be found. The girl, puzzled, got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The door to her parents' room was ajar, and she pushed it open softly and looked in. Her parents appeared to be sleeping soundly, and so she went back to bed. In the morning, she saw the doll with the purple fingernails was sitting on the table by her bed, exactly where she had left it. She assumed that she must have just been having a bad dream, but when she went into her parents' room that morning, she found them both lying dead in a pool of blood. There were 2 purple doll fingernails stabbed into their hearts.